Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to the Theosophical Society Point Loma. Tonight we begin a series of 4 lectures entitled Theosophia, the mother of all religions. And tonight's talk is called the Universal Theosophical Movement. People who come into contact with Theosophy for the first time often ask us whether Theosophy is a religion. And our short answer is always no. Theosophy is not a religion and certainly not a faith. Theosophy, or rather the ancient Theosophia, divine wisdom, is the synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. But how is it possible that when Theosophy is not a religion, it is the mother of all religions? Well, that's a valid question, and we will try to answer that question. And to do so, we will first have to say something about Theosophy, or rather Theosophia, because there is a difference between the two. We will explain it. And we also need to dwell on the Theosophical movement. What kind of movement is that? But let me first say this. I assume you are listening to this lecture because you expect or hope to find a little more truth. That is indeed a requirement. You must have a desire, a thirst to know the truth, because otherwise you won't find it. Gottfried de Perucker, in his book The Golden Precept of Esotericism, says, "There is a hunger in every human heart, which nothing can satisfy or appease. A hunger for something more true than ordinary human beings wit of. A hunger for the real, a hunger for the sublime. It's the nostalgia of the soul, of the spirit soul of man. The source of this longing is the homesickness brought about by the soul memory of our spiritual abode, whence we came and towards which we are now on our return journey." In other words, if you want to understand Theosophy and the Theosophical movement, you must turn away from the material world and focus on the spiritual side. And this is an active process. Don't just sit back and let it come to you. Well, let us first consider what Theosophy is. Many of you have been studying Theosophy for years, or even decades, but it's always refreshing to reflect on it again. The word Theosophy became familiar to the Greeks in the 3rd century with Ammonius Saccas and the Alexandrian Neoplatonist. It is derived from Theos, divine, Sophia, wisdom. It is therefore divine wisdom, or the wisdom of the gods. This is the first hurdle you have to overcome in order to understand Theosophy, because in our Western societies we don't know any gods. At most we know of one God. For most of us, gods are archaic remnants of a time when people were uncivilized pagans. But is that really the case? Were all those great philosophers from antiquity, from Greece, from Asia, fools who believed in fairy tales? Well, we come back to it later. More important for now is, what does this divine wisdom, this Theosophy, entail? That sounds like an easy question, but it's very difficult to answer. Why? Because the depth of the divine wisdom is very, very profound. It actually contains everything that exists. It is therefore called the synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. It answers the questions of how the world is, science, why the world and the things are as they are, philosophy, and where all this leads, what's the meaning of it all, religion. And Theosophy, being the synthesis of the 3 faculties of thought, forges these three methods of thinking into a unity. Theosophy is based on a few principles that are far-reaching but still more or less comprehensible to us, provided we are willing to think about them. Theosophy can be compared to an ocean of wisdom and knowledge, which is not too deep for even a child at the shores, but it is so unfathomable beyond the shores that even the greatest thinkers can only comprehend a small part of it. Before we examine these three basic principles, I would like to add one more aspect to this description of Theosophy, which is very important, because otherwise it might seem as if Theosophy is a theoretical system of thought. But Theosophy is above all a philosophy of life, which provides a very solid basis for ethics. Now, what are the principles of Theosophy? There are three basic principles, three fundamental propositions formulated in the Secret Doctrine, the book of Helena Blavatsky, the magnum opus of Blavatsky, the most important founder of the Theosophical Society. The first is boundlessness, or as Blavatsky puts it, a boundless principle. She calls it an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle. Pay particular attention to the word principle. For us, a principle is an abstraction, not something that exists, not something concrete. It's not like a tree or a table or a human or a god. No, it's an abstraction, an idea. You cannot capture it in a word. You cannot grasp it or point at it and say, here it is. Although it is everywhere, you can't tell where it is located. But at the same time, paradoxically, it's omnipresent. It is everywhere because it is everything. Furthermore, and this is equally important, everything that exists is a living entity. Although the principle is not a god, not a being, it is life, abstract life, metaphorically speaking, the heartbeat of all that exists. And being part of boundless life, however abstract that may be, means that everything that exists is also alive. Moreover, it's eternally alive, because there is boundlessness, there's no beginning, no end. And the consequence of this first principle is therefore that we are consciousness, that we are conscious beings. The idea that life ceases to exist when the body no longer functions and falls apart is absurd if you start from this premise. We are consciousness, and that is essentially boundless. This boundless principle is the cornerstone on which the entire system of teachings, Theosophy, is based. It implies that everything that exists has a common origin. And after all, the principle is omnipresent. It is both an ant in your garden and the most highly developed God. In other words, there is an essential unity underlying all that exists. You should think for yourself what this means in relation to your attitude towards your fellow human beings, or towards the animals and the plant world. The idea of universal brotherhood thus gains enormous depth. That consciousness that every being is manifests itself cyclically. That's the second premise, the second fundamental proposition. That is to say, periods of rest alternate with periods of activity. It's the ebb and flow of life. Death and life are like sleeping and waking. Every time we manifest ourselves, we enter into a cooperative connection with countless other beings, countless other consciousnesses. I'm not just talking about humans, about a set of parents without whom birth cannot take place, but also about the billions and billions of living beings. We need those beings to build our vehicle, our body. Think of all those cells and atoms that form our body as a single unit. No one can live alone. Isolation, separateness does not exist, although some living in illusion believe that it does. The third principle is difficult to sum up in a single word. It refers to the collaborations and inseparable connections that exist between all the different beings during those periods of activity. The period of activity is initiated by a highly developed being called the Oversoul, the universal Oversoul in the secret doctrine. The Oversoul emanates a field from itself, process of emanation, which attracts other, less developed beings, which in turn emanate a field which attracts other, less developed beings, and so on. Do not view the Oversoul as an all-powerful God. Certainly not. There are countless universes in boundless space, each with its own summit, its own Oversoul. So there are hierarchies of life, there are hierarchies within hierarchies, and likewise there is equality, because all these beings of a hierarchy are identical to the summit, to the Oversoul, even though they are not yet so highly developed. And the hunger in everyone's heart, with which I began this talk, is the homesickness to return to and become one with the top of the hierarchy, with that which is in fact the heart of your own consciousness, the essence, the core of your being. Now, the elaboration of these three principles forms a powerful, gigantic field of teachings, of ideas, of connections between all those beings, all those hierarchies, reaching from the heart of the universe, via our sun, the planet, to all the realms of nature on our planet, in the enormous multitude of living beings which form together a gigantic web in which everything is interconnected. A grand, impressively great image. It's very easy to get lost in the details, and yet the basic ideas are not that difficult, although they are often different from what we have been taught in our education. Theosophia paints a picture of this gigantic web of life, and these theosophical ideas have been taught to humanity in all civilizations, throughout all ages, albeit sometimes in different words, sometimes in different imagery. This depends on the culture, the era, the humanity that lived in that time. So there has always been a universal theosophical movement. It goes back to the dawn of time. So from the first awakening of human thought, our ability to think, there have been impulses, there have been teachers who have taught this divine wisdom to us, and many of those attempts have been lost in the hundreds of thousands of years that humanity has existed. But if you read the secret doctrine, you will quickly notice that dozens of examples are given of religions, philosophies, philosophers, and seers and sages who, albeit sometimes in different words, presented us the same ancient wisdom. I will give you some names of what Theosophy was called in earlier times. It was called the wisdom religion, the Prajnaparamita, it's a Buddhic term, Chokma, as it is called in Hebrew, Hermeticism, the ancient wisdom, Gnosis, Gupta Vidya, that means the secret doctrine, and the esoteric philosophy. I would like to briefly discuss the latter two. Why? Because it seems contradictory when I say that Theosophy has been taught throughout the ages. Well, it is also esoteric, that is intended for a small group, and it is secret to the masses. This contradiction is easily explained. Theosophy was proclaimed to humanity by the universal Theosophical movement. More about that movement later. But always in a way that suited the comprehension of humanity at that time. Initially, at the dawn of self-awareness, when humanity was in its infancy, and when I speak of humanity, I mean you and me in those distant times, we are taught in the same way you teach children. Nevertheless, there came a time when knowledge could not longer be freely imparted. And why not? Because humanity had reached a stage in its development where it identified so strongly with matter, with the material side of life, that selfish desires had taken on such proportions that any knowledge would immediately be used to satisfy those selfish desires. And this would greatly increase the chaos, injustice, and disharmony. Moreover, a humanity that has immersed itself completely in the material side of nature is no longer receptive to more spiritual and ethical teachings. They simply would not understand them. And if they were given away, misunderstanding and misinterpretation would arise, causing even more chaos. The main title of this series of lectures is Theosophia, the mother of all religions, and that is undoubtedly completely true. All religions from the past and the present have originated from the source of the divine wisdom, which we call Theosophia. But we must also, unfortunately, note that all of these religions have deviated from their mother. And some of these religions have deviated so far from the source that they teach things that are completely different from what their mother taught them. From that time on, when the potential for abuse became life-threatening, theosophical teachings were no longer given to everyone. Or rather, the large, mostly selfish masses received those teachings in the form of myths, parables. This greatly reduced the chance that the teachings would be misused or distorted. Only a small group of humans who had demonstrated in their daily lives that they would not use the knowledge for selfish poor purpose were taught the secret teachings. Hence the term Gupta Vidya, secret doctrine. However, sufficient knowledge about Theosophy has always been given. Certainly the fundamental teachings, such as the three propositions, have never been withheld from humanity, although they were not always phrased in the same way. I've made a list, which is by no means exhaustive, of how the idea of boundlessness has been expressed in various spiritual traditions. It was called Tao, a Chinese word that is virtually untranslatable, but nevertheless, usually it's translated with path or way, but actually it implies boundlessness. This is abundantly clear from the first verse of the Tao Te Ching by I.S.I.S. It reads, "The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao." Logical, because as soon as you limit the boundless with a word, it's no longer boundless. The Vedic sages refer to the boundless with the word Parabrahman. Brahman is the highest conceivable God. And para means beyond, So beyond Brahma, beyond the highest conceivable God, beyond every horizon. There are no words for it. And that's why the Vedic sages simply called it Tat, which means that. And the Upanishad teaches Tat Tvam Asi. You are Tat. You are the boundless. In Buddhist texts, boundlessness is sometimes referred to as the void, emptiness, or in Sanskrit, sunyata. And this resembles an image found in the Scandinavian Eddas, and also in other civilizations, that of the abyss. Now, when you hear the term God the Father, you may think of a deity rather than the boundless. But in one of the Gnostic writings, we read the following description of God the Father. I'm talking about the Apocryphon of John, that means the secret book of John, one of the Nag Hammadi scriptures found in the sands of the Sahara Desert in Egypt in 1945. And God is God a monad, or an indivisible unity. It is further said, and I quote, "The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is the one who exists as God and Father of everything, the invisible one who is above everything, who exists as incorruptibility, who is pure light that no eye can behold. It is the invisible spirit of whom it is not right to think of as a God or anything like that, for it's more than a God, because there's nothing above it, for it establishes itself, it's eternal, because it needs nothing, for it is complete perfection, it lacks nothing, which makes it complete, it's boundless, it's unfathomable, it's immeasurable, invisible, inexpressible, innameable, eternal. It's no entity. It's neither small or large. Neither small or large. You see, there is a search for words to describe the boundless. And this description of the deity continues for 3 pages. In fact, only saying what this God is not. It has no properties. Plato also said that if you strip something of all its properties, you are left with only a principle. And the only positive thing that is said about God the Father in this Gnostic scripture is that he, or rather it, is everything, nothing excluded. And this description, by the way, is attributed to Jesus, not just anyone, I might add. Finally, the image of Allah. And of course, there are millions of Muslims who anthropomorphize this image of Allah, because they take certain texts in the Quran too literally. But there are plenty of indications that you can take it another way. I give you one example. I could have given many more. The Quran states in Surah I.S.I.S, chapter 112, verse 3, that Allah begets not, nor was he begotten. This verse emphasizes Allah's absolute oneness and uniqueness. And if you dwell on it a little bit longer, you understand that what is being referred to here is the boundlessness of everything. The fact that Allah was not begotten, means that he, or it, has always existed, not begotten, always existed. And the fact that he did not beget can only mean that he did not create or otherwise shape anything. And that means that everything that exists have always existed, because we cannot deny the universe and the multitude of beings. So everything has always been part of the boundless, a logical thought. Well, dear friends, the other propositions from the secret doctrine, cyclicity, the various laws of nature, such as the law of karma, cause and effect, they can all be found in the various religious and philosophical traditions of the world. Sometimes you have to dig a little, because the original teachings are covered with fantasy, with degenerative images arising from people's personal views. Sometimes you also need to know the language. And I don't just mean the language that we humans speak, and that is already very difficult to understand those ancient languages. But I also mean the imagery, the myths, the fairy tales, the parables, the paradoxes, in which the teachings were sometimes cast. But it is possible. With some practice, you can rediscover the basic theosophical ideas. So the idea that behind all these expressions there must have been, or still is, one and the same movement is not such a crazy or unscientific idea. So there must have been humans, or perhaps other beings other than humans, who gave us these teachings, who gave us theosophy. Now there is a difference between theosophy and theosophia. You see, the last impulse to give this divine wisdom to humanity was the one that began in 1875 with the founding of the Theosophical Society by H.P. Blavatsky, William Quine Church, Henry Steele Olcott, and a few others. Following the example of the group of philosophers in Alexandria at the beginning of our era, they named the organization they founded the Theosophical Society. And in Blavatsky's publications, the teachings she gave in written and sometimes orally, she called it Theosophy. And her teachers too, more about them later, spoke of their teachings as Theosophy in the letters they wrote to two Englishmen. And this gave us a picture of what Theosophy, the wisdom of the gods, entails. But do you think that Blavatsky and her teachers gave us all the knowledge they had gathered? And note, the knowledge that Blavatsky's teachers had gathered and developed within themselves was collected in the most scientific manner. They have compared all their wisdom much more scientifically than is done at our scientific institutes. Only a part of that divine wisdom has been given to humanity through H.P. Blavatsky. And we call that part Theosophy. Theosophy is in fact a limited representation of the wisdom religion, the wisdom of the gods. It is this part of the essentially boundless Theosophia that is now within our grasp, that we can understand if we try very hard. But there is much, much more. The wisdom of the gods contains infinitely more, and that we call Theosophia. You see the difference? Theosophy could be called a part, Theosophia the whole, the infinite whole. That doesn't mean, of course, that Theosophy is not true, certainly not, but the truth is limited compared to Theosophia. The representations, the images of the cosmos and life that have been communicated to us, however sublime they may be to us, are only one facet of the totality. Even the wording of the three fundamental propositions, of course, is entirely correct and true in itself, but it could be expressed in a more sharper and more universal way. And you see, we must be modest. We know very, very little compared to those who allowed us to share in their wisdom. But then, who are those beings, those men or those gods who compose the universal theosophical movement? Let us try to find an answer by examining the three fundamental principles in more detail. If there is boundlessness, and if everything, every being necessarily is a part of that boundlessness, then there must be beings that are much more developed than we are. And also beings that are not yet as developed as we are. When the third fundamental principle talks about the oversoul and hierarchies of life, hierarchies of consciousness, it's obvious that although there is an essential unity, each being is at its own stage of consciousness. Take a good look at yourself. Not at your appearance, but at your consciousness. Consider the different aspects of your consciousness. We now have decades of experience with our course Thinking Differently, which we updated a few years ago, and now it is called the course Universal Wisdom. The course will start in 2 weeks, November 16. Very good course, I think. You can still register, go to our website if you want. Well, in that course, we explain the different aspects of human consciousness. And we have never seen a student who does not recognize these different aspects in themselves, or at least recognizes them in broad terms. So we can recognize the different forces within ourselves. It is therefore not so difficult to experience that there are forces, aspects of our consciousness that tend toward the material, the earthly world that causes us to live within the limitation of external life. But there are also aspects of consciousness that tend to the upward. These are aspects that makes us see the connections, the inseparable connections with the rest of life, and even evoke in us an awareness of the essential unity of life. What do you think? Which aspects tend more toward the divine? Those focused on the earth, which cause us to live in the illusion of separateness, or the aspects that bring about a sense of connectedness and unity within us? Then we go a step further. Will those more noble aspects within us be a final destination? I mean, will these aspects never be able to develop further? Is there nothing beyond that? Or could it be that there are beings who have developed these aspects to a much greater and much more universal extent? These are questions you must answer for yourself. But they are reasonable questions, and they at least provide a logical basis for the idea of beings who are more developed than humans. You might say, but I don't see those gods. Have you ever wondered whether the beings of the lower realms of nature see you as a human being? Imagine you have chickens. Every morning you throw a few handfuls of corn into the chicken coop. Will those chickens know you as a human being? Know that you are a being, a consciousness? Now there are also more highly developed animals such as dogs, and you can at least have a contact with them. But does a dog understand your concerns, your ideas, your ambitions? Or does it only experience you as a being that is higher in the hierarchy, as a kind of super dog? What I'm trying to say is, that's logical that we cannot perceive the gods because we have not awakened the divine consciousness within ourselves. Nevertheless, we experience the divine, but in the same way that chickens experience the person who throws food in the chicken coop every morning. For those chickens, that's a law of nature, a habit. Now, what we call the laws of nature are the habitual patterns of those more highly developed beings we call gods. I'm not only referring to the laws of nature, such as the law of gravity, but also to what in Theosophy is called the 7 jewels of wisdom. Ask a physicist what the law of natures are. He may be able to explain them to you. He may know how they work and be able to calculate with them. But does he know what they are? We say they are the habits, the habitual patterns of divine beings. And that's why in ancient cultures, such as in Greece or in Africa or in the ancient Americas, and as is still the case today in India and other Asian countries, people believe in gods. This is not strange. Those are not outdated ideas, but actually they are very natural. Now, many of those people have anthropomorphized those gods. That's to say, they image them as humans, and often not even very fine humans. The god Zeus from Greek mythology is actually a very selfish, often deceitful character, a kind of Don Juan. But the gods, as they appear in myths, often represent an aspect of humanity or a characteristic of nature. But all the great philosophers of antiquity, from Plato to Pythagoras and Plato, they all believed in gods, in divine beings, beings who, hierarchically speaking, relate to us in the same way as we relate to animals. How unnatural it was when the Christian churches, the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches, embraced monotheism. The instincts of the people could not accept this, and the result was that divine consciousnesses, the gods, were replaced by deceased people who were called saints. It's simply a copy of the believing gods of what we now call pagans. The extent to which you experience the influence of the gods depends on the extent to which your consciousness as a human being corresponds with it. If you are closer to the realm of the gods in your consciousness, you will experience that divine influence earlier and more intensely than if you are not yet so far developed. Just as more developed animals, pets for instance, have more contact with humans than, say, an earthworm. Now those divine beings, at least some of them, can be called the guiding, inspiring forces in that universal theosophical movement. They form the hierarchy of compassion, especially those who have given up their own development and who have identified themselves so completely with the oneness of life that they live only for the totality of all expressions of life. That attitude we call compassion. They are the leading forces in the hierarchy of compassion, their wisdom, and their compassion is what have been able to glimpse and what we call Theosophy. They form a hierarchy that reaches from the heart of the universe through countless links of gods, demigods to our earthly sphere. But as mentioned, there are people who have come closer to those divine realms and therefore experience the influence more intensely and have thus studied more of the universal Theosophia and indeed have become it. These human beings, great, highly exalted, wise and compassionate humans, are called the masters of wisdom and compassion. They also belong to that universal theosophical movement. They are closer to us than the gods, logically, because they are human beings, albeit very exalted human beings, who have developed their inherent potentialities much more than the average person. It was these masters of wisdom and compassion who were the actual founders of the Theosophical Society. It was they who sought Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a European vehicle capable of proclaiming the message she knew, According to their own account, they searched for more than 100 years before finding a suitable vehicle. These masters have united in a community we call the Order of Wisdom and Compassion, also known as the White Lodge. There is a center, a headquarters in Western Central Asia, but there are branches of that great lodge all over the earth. These masters have been active for as long as humanity has existed. In many civilizations, they are referred to as people who are almost demigods, who possess abilities that we don't consider possible, and who, most importantly, are motivated by compassion and constantly strive to guide their younger brothers. They cannot grow for us, but they have the knowledge and wisdom to teach us, to teach how to complete our evolutionary pilgrimage. I've made a list, by no means complete, of how these masters were or are referred to in the different cultures. Take a look at it. I would like to briefly explain some of these names given to the masters. For instance, the term Tirthankara from Chinism, a religion older even than Buddhism. It literally means a ford maker, and a ford is a fordable passage across samsara, across the sea of endless birth and death. Well, beautiful metaphor. This metaphor closely resembles the Buddhist concept of Tathagata, which means he who has reached the other shore. Well, the Chinese say that there are 24 of these Tirthankaras who are also called the saviors of mankind. Then Zarathustra. Orientalists consider Zarathustra to be a personal name, just as they do with Christ. But if you do that, you run into enormous difficulties in dating when this Zarathustra would have lived. Initially, it was assumed that he lived around the 6th century before Christ, but nowadays the 12th or the 13th century before Christ is mentioned. The idea that there could have been several Zarathustras does not occur to scholars, but just as Buddha or Christ is a title, so is Zarathustra. And that's why we also speak here of Christoi, the plural, the anointed ones, a title that appeared centuries before the supposed birth of Jesus. Then Wali, the friend of Allah, a title also given to some Sufis. And finally, the ancestor. In Africa, and Europeans have adopted this, this is usually understood to mean the deceased family members. But there are certainly also people who mean the same thing as when we speak of the elder brothers, the masters. Undoubtedly, people form different traditions, and all those different traditions will not have an image that fully corresponds with what these masters really are. Nevertheless, this incomplete list shows that the idea is widespread, that there are humans who are far ahead of the average person and who try to inspire and help us on our pilgrimage. There are indeed elder brothers, older in experience and therefore older in wisdom and compassion. And just as the younger brother does not know the exact motives and ideas of his older brother, so we will color the image of these masters of wisdom and compassion according to our own mentality and our own experience. Nevertheless, we can know them to some extent. First of all, because there are individuals who do have contact with them. These are their disciples, called chelas. Those chelas also belong to the universal Theosophical movement, you can clearly see the hierarchical line, the hierarchy of compassion. First the gods, the Jnani Chohans, as they are called, or the Jnani Buddhas, heavenly Buddhas. Then the Manusha Buddhas, human Buddhas, the most developed of the masters of wisdom and compassion. Then the Mahatmas, then their disciples, the chelas, and then there are the true Theosophists. Ordinary people, you might say, but people who have their hearts in the right place, who, in their own modest way, also practice compassion. Perhaps they don't even know that they too are building blocks in the hierarchy of compassion and servants of the gods. Now those masters and the disciples, the chelas, are closer to us. And in the recent history of these masters, we have come to know a number of these chelas. Blavatsky was one of them. In her books and articles, she also provides some information about the adepts, as they are also called. She gives us some information about their knowledge, wisdom, abilities, which sometimes seem miraculous to us, but that's because we don't know the laws on which they are based. These are abilities that we will all develop in distant future. Other chelas, Damodar, for example, a young Hindu living at that time in the 19th century, he has also told us about them, written about them, and we know them maybe best through the letters they wrote themselves to A.P. Synod, an Englishman who lived in India in the early years of the Theosophical Society, and who, thanks to Blavatsky's mediation, corresponded with two of the Mahatmas. Those letters are a source of wisdom, and we learn something about difficulties these masters encounter in clarifying their teachings, Theosophy. That is certainly not an easy task, especially since the Englishman Synod had a Western and therefore totally different way of thinking than the masters. In order to have a good transfer of thoughts, both people, the sender and receiver, must be tuned to the same wavelength. The masters are on the wavelength, the frequency of Theosophy, so to speak. The masters do not descend to our level, we must rise to their level. So if you want to communicate with them, you will at least need to know the basic principles of Theosophy and, above all, apply them. These are not so much the difficult technical teachings, but rather the consequences of them, and in particular, the three fundamental principles, for it's all about unity of life, and the consequence of this unity, the universal brotherhood of all that lives. Now you may ask whether the Theosophical Society also belongs to that Theosophical movement. Superficially, one would say yes, they have the same name, Theosophical. However, I would like to say the following about this. I just mentioned Blavatsky, Ogold, and Church as the founders of the Theosophical Society, and in a sense they are. But are they really? Suppose I devise a plan for some organization. I determine what it should look like, what its objectives are, etc. In addition, I select the people who will lead that organization. Then those people go to a notary and register their club, their association. Who is the real founder? Do you understand what I mean? It was the masters of wisdom and compassion who were behind the founding of the Theosophical Society. Two of them in particular worked hard to achieve this. They asked their chief for permission. Wasn't it too early? Even among the Mahatmas there were certain considerations, but their boss, called the Mahachohan, agreed. He gave permission. Helena Blavatsky was sought out. She was put in touch with Olcott and Judge, and the rest is history. Helena Blavatsky said many times in her writings that it is the Mahatmas who are the real founders of the Theosophical Society. Moreover, she says, if they wouldn't have been present in the background of the TS, the organization would have collapsed long ago. How is that possible? Well, let me compare it to raising a child. When the child is a toddler, the parents will often make decisions and protect it from falling, missteps, etc. We all know that. But as the child grows older, it becomes more and more independent from its parents, makes its own decisions, which are not always very wise, and sometimes go directly against the advice of its parents. What I'm trying to say with all this, well, the Theosophical Society was intended to be the vehicle of the masters, the vehicle of the universal theosophical movement. But the constituent parts of the vehicle, that is the members, must align themselves with the objective and work together, not allowing their own personal views to permeate the movement. Imagine that in the vehicle of a human being, in his body, certain organs or certain cells do not submit to the overarching power of human consciousness. That vehicle would certainly not function optimally if it did not become completely ill and die. Well, the fact that the Theosophical Society, Point Loma, the organization hosting you tonight, still exists, as well as the organization headquartered in I.S.I.S, India, shows that the power of the masters had not been completely exhausted, because after 150 years we still exist. And much good has certainly been done by these organizations. Some hard-working theosophists have devoted themselves to giving theosophy its rightful place in the world. Streams of thoughts, of theosophical ideas have entered the thought sphere, which have certainly changed certain aspects of the intellectual climate. To give you just one example, the number of people who believe in reincarnation and no longer believe in the dogmas of hell and heaven has increased enormously, especially in Western countries. We are very grateful to all those known and unknown men and women who have worked so hard for theosophy, for humanity, for the idea of universal brotherhood. Unfortunately, there's also a downside. The Theosophical Society was formed by human beings, and human beings are often fallible. Now, making mistakes is not so bad, but persisting in those mistakes can be disastrous, especially when those mistakes stem from personality and personal ideas supplanting actual theosophical ideas. I'm not going to give you examples of this. Anyone who studies the 150 years history of the Theosophical Society, the splits off, etc., will encounter them for themselves. But actually, I don't find that very interesting. Much more interesting is whether the members of the Theosophical Society, Point Loma, I.S.I.S, of any other organization, are people who call themselves Theosophists, but are not affiliated with any organization. Much more interesting it is whether these people, these students of the ancient wisdom, adhere to the original ideas that the masters had in mind when they took the initiative to found the Theosophical Society. Do we want to keep the teachings pure? Do we want, for example, to make no changes in the standard works of our great teachers, H.P. Blavatsky, Church, the Baruch, and others, and not rewrite them according to our ideas? Do we still want to uphold universality? Or do we find our civilization and our religion, and it doesn't matter whether it is Christianity or Hinduism or whatever, just a little bit better, a little bit more important, a little more in accordance with the truth than the other religions of others? Do we hold to what Master Kuthumi wrote in a letter, that the chief object of the Theosophical Society is not so much to gratify the individual aspirations as to serve our fellow human beings? Are we keeping Theosophy alive? Are we applying it? Are we remaining open to deeper insights? Or are we becoming dogmatic? If not being true to the original plan, to the idea of compassion, to the teachings as given to us, we will cut ourselves from the universal Theosophical movement. And in a century or so, a new religion will have arisen, one that has degenerated and from which the living soul has disappeared. And in 20 centuries, a new messenger from the universal Theosophical movement will once again have to come to explain what the real purpose of the TS was and what the real Theosophical teachings of the Master and H.P. Blavatsky entailed. Next week, when we talk about the different religions, we will see that this has happened by many of the earlier impulses of the hierarchy of compassion. But of course, it does not have to happen. There is no doom. There is no law that dictates that we must water down our efforts and that we should pollute the pure water of Theosophia by mixing our personal, often selfish ideas with it. You can remain faithful to Theosophy as it was shaped for our time by the sacrificial work of H.P. Blavatsky and make this compassionate impulse of the universal Theosophical movement a success. This does not mean that everyone must become a member of a Theosophical organization, but it does mean that everyone, wherever they live, should have access to, and that the compassionate power of Theosophy should enlighten our hearts, sharpen our intellect, thereby creating more and more cooperation and harmony within humanity, within society, and between the countries. Thank you very much for your attention. There's now a 3-minute break, and after that there is the opportunity to ask your questions. You can do that to use the YouTube chat or by sending an email to questions@blavatskyhouse.org. And after the questions in the chat have been answered, at least I will try to answer them, then there will be an interactive study via Zoom. And would you like to participate and you are not yet in Zoom? Well, send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org and we can send you an email with the Zoom link. You are very welcome to join us and to talk about those principal ideas of Theosophy. So I see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back. And Bouke, are there any questions?
No.
No questions?
We didn't receive any question now. No.
Okay, then I have some questions for you. Just one thing before we close. Every Sunday at 4 o'clock, and it starts in the 16th, I think, of November, the course Universal Wisdom. Yeah, you can discuss the basic principles with a few other interested people. So just to remember you. And then, of course, next week, we have another lecture. It's about what religion really is. And we conclude with the Gayatri, invocation to our own inner God, represented here as a golden sun. O thou, golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant calls of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.